Welcome to Scary Stories. Tonight we have a collection of security guard stories sent in by you guys, all of which I am told really happened. If you've ever had a cryptid encounter, especially if you've had a run-in with a Dogman, we're very interested to hear your tale. Stay tuned to the end and our little mascot Henry will come along and explain how to send your true stories in. Tonight's collection was sent in by listeners who work security gigs. We do seem to have a lot of them, and we salute all of you out there, keeping America's buildings and factories safe on the overnights, and listening to our show while you do it. This episode is for all of you men and women, and we call it Spooky True Security Guard Dogman Stories, read aloud in the rain. Story number 1. Female security guard. In over my head. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I am a female in my early 20s who has been working security jobs off and on since I was 18. I also sometimes temp at offices, but I find it easier to work nights so that I have an excuse to sleep all day while my mom wants to yell at me to move out. That's why I can't pay to be a channel member. I'm saving up to try to get into a roommate situation somewhere else. I'm not her favorite daughter, and I'd rather not have to be reminded of that every day. But this isn't a story about my mom. It's a story about me seeing a Dogman, 100% definitely, but also me seeing something that might have been maybe a Sasquatch, I guess. The two of them were fighting, and they knocked out a whole chunk of the chain link fence around this one plant I get assigned to sometimes. It was raining so hard that night. You should play rain sound effects behind the story, because it seriously did not let up ever that night. It was like we should call out Noah to build us an ark, it was that bad. Well, let me tell the story from the beginning without stopping, otherwise I get confused and I go in circles. Feel free to edit me. I'm not great at writing my thoughts down, okay? But this all really happened to me, so don't change any of the details around, that's all I ask. Now, I can't name the plant I'm talking about because I do still get assigned to work over there sometimes, but it's pretty far out of town. They sent me there because I live out of town myself. Sometimes they find it hard to round up enough people who can even get out there to work the place, especially on overnights. So the night in question, I was driving out there in the rain, and it was coming down so hard, it was almost like I was in Waterworld, that old movie from 100 years ago. If you don't know what I mean, don't worry about it. The movie sucked. And so did this night. It really sucked. If I ever wanted to call in sick, it was that night. But then I'd just be going home to get yelled at by my mom, so I drove on through the rain on the wettest night in history. When I managed to get around to the plant without skidding off the road, I had to kind of drive along the side of it to get to the entrance, but when I reached the first corner, I saw stuff going on that made no sense whatsoever. Like, I couldn't see what I was seeing, if that makes any sense. There was no traffic, so I kind of turned the car diagonal in the middle of the road to point my headlights on the commotion I saw in the dark, right? And so I'm idling in the center of the road, and my high beams are lighting up big things moving around in the pouring rain. I mean, I'm looking at it with the high beams on, and I still don't know what I'm seeing, if that makes any sense. The rain is pounding off two really big things moving around very fast. I was so confused. I put the car into drive, and I inched it closer and closer so I could try to see what I was seeing. And then, I swear to you, my brain started to assemble the information into one picture, but it still didn't make any sense. Because what I thought I was seeing was a big werewolf battling some kind of a furry caveman. I mean, I know what a Dogman is supposed to look like. I am a subscriber to your channel, and a few others that talk about Dogman, so although I wasn't sure I really believed in it before I saw it, at least I knew what that was. It was a lot like a dog, but it stood up on its hind legs like a man. It had a dog head. It had a long snout. It had clawed paws that were so large they were almost like hands. Now that's a Dogman, right? What else could that be? Except maybe a werewolf or a rougarou. But this wasn't in New Orleans, so that had to have been the Dogman or the Wisconsin werewolf, which I guess is probably the same thing. But that creature was fighting something, and the creature it was fighting, I have to say, was not a Dogman for sure. It was the same size as the Dogman, and both of them were ridiculously tall. I hate to even talk about how tall they were, because it makes people roll their eyes and think that I was driving while intoxicated. They were super big though. They were significantly larger than men, so it wasn't guys in costumes. Maybe it was polar bears in costumes or something, because both of these critters had to be like 11 or 12 feet tall, which I know makes me sound like a Looney Tune. Why do you think I sat there staring at them with my high beams on? It was a pretty crazy thing to see. I got a couple of decent looks at the one that wasn't a Dogman, and it was kind of upsetting. I mean, it looked so human. When the Dogman bit it at one point, I caught the reaction on its face, and it looked just like you or I would look if getting bitten by a Dogman. It made my heart go out to it, whatever it was. Well, I'm going to call that one a Bigfoot, but the face was shockingly more human than I would have expected a Bigfoot to look like. It had a furry body like a gorilla, but it stood taller and straighter. And that face, those eyes, they seemed freakishly, disturbingly human. It was a walking nightmare. It really was. It looked too much like one of us, but it wasn't at all. I honestly wonder if that thing is attracted to human females. That's kind of what I found disturbing about it. I bet it is, you know. What a horrible thing to have walking around the countryside in the modern day. They talk about the cities not being safe, but at least the cities don't have these giant caveman Sasquatch men roaming around without any pants on. Now, as much as my mom calls me a lazy bum, I'm actually fairly conscientious about my job. I saw the two beasts slamming each other into the chain link fence surrounding the plant, and I knew this was going to turn into a security problem if they breached the perimeter. I pulled the car around, checked in, and immediately started shouting to the guy I was there to replace about the situation. There's no camera on that particular corner of the fencing, as it's considered secure. We have cameras over areas we expect people to possibly enter and exit from, so I don't think this guy had any clue whatsoever what was going on outside. I told him to call the cops out, and he just laughed at me with his stoner's laugh and asked me to take a deep breath and start over from the beginning. So I was like, there's a couple of giant monsters fighting each other on the southwest corner of our fencing enclosure. He laughed even harder. Giant monsters? Is it Godzilla versus Megalon, he asked me. I always liked him for staying relaxed before, but that night, he was seriously trying my patience. So I got him to walk with me through the storm out to look at that corner of the fence and see if the Dogman and the freaky thing were still there. Well, they weren't, but the fence was bashed in exactly where I said they had been fighting. I guess the two of them must have chased each other back into the woods because they were nowhere to be seen in that pouring rain. Like I said, the fence was all bent in, and we walked over to examine it more closely. The guy asked me if I did this, and then it was my turn to laugh. When we walked right up to it, we could both see that I had to reach up to where it got bashed in. It was up over my head. So I told him, yeah, I did that myself, sure. I called out the police, but all that served to do was get me wetter, and then I got sick on the way home. While home sick, I got a call from the agency, chewing me out for telling the truth about the Dogman and the Sasquatch. That wasn't the way she put it. She said she was unhappy with me for lying. I asked her why I would lie about the incident to the police, especially when it meant standing out there in the pouring rain and getting myself sick showing them the place in the process. She accused me of faking being sick, and we got into a real argument over the phone. I asked her if it wasn't what I said, then how did the fence get all bent in and knocked out of place over my head then? She told me she didn't know, but she knew I was up to something. I told her to fire me then I hung up. She won't fire me for telling the truth, but I tell you what, if I ever see a Dogman or a Bigfoot breaking the perimeter of a job I'm working ever again, I'm just gonna let him do it. The other guy working security that night, he went home on time, he didn't get sick, and he didn't get yelled at. He also didn't do his job right, but if that's what they want, I can do that too. But if there are any dogmen or werewolves listening to this show right now, I ask you please, go have your turf wars around someone else's overnight gig, huh? I'm still getting over that cold from last time. Story number 2. Dogman, north of Detroit. Dear Scary Stories NYC. When I was young, I was a security guard working in and around Detroit. I had a car, so I sometimes got assigned to jobs a little further away from the city to the north. Like, there were these manufacturing plants up and down the St. Clair River, which is an east-west barrier between Michigan and Canada. It was while working at one of those plants back a bunch of years ago that I had my one personal experience with a cryptid. In my case, I saw what had to have been a dogman. I didn't talk about it much for years because, well, it wasn't a Bigfoot sighting. So people who never heard of the dogman would just treat me differently after they heard the story. My grandson clued me in that Dogman is much more known now, so he told me to pull the story out of mothballs for you. Here I am doing it. This is a true story, but is also an old story, so I hope I'm remembering all the details correctly. I'm not going to name the factory as there were a few over there, and I might be confusing two of them together. I guarantee it was a manufacturing plant by the St. Clair River and Canada, but it might have been one of 3 that I used to work back in those days. I mean, we're talking 1969 or 1970 here. This didn't happen yesterday. I was 20 or 21 years old maybe when this happened, not a day older. I think I thought I'd be seeing monsters all the time for the rest of my life. I didn't really register how rare and special an occurrence this was. I understood how scary it was, though. Believe me. Now, in those days, not all the plants had fancy TV monitors yet. Now they probably do with computers, I guess, right? Well, this plant had 3 cameras and 1 monitor that would show all 3. It would rotate which was the large screen on top, and the other 2 would go small at the bottom until it was their turn to go up on top again. The cameras were on the 2 entrances or exits, and this other room inside that either had something expensive in it, or maybe poisonous or something. I don't know if I knew or cared even back then, to be honest. I was not the best security guard, and I'm glad I eventually found the profession that I did. So when an alarm tripped at an area of the plant that had no camera in it, I was not excited about being told to go investigate. We had a system at that plant where one guy was the boss, and the other guy was me. I never got to be the boss, but it usually didn't even matter. I mean, why would anyone ever break into a manufacturing plant at night? We'd each have our own transistor radio with an earplug, and we'd listen to the radio until it was time to leave. Sometimes we'd walk the rounds, but like I said, it was just taking a stroll in the evening and listening to the radio. Nothing bad ever happened. And then, like I said, an alarm tripped, and I had to go out into the dark and check out to see if someone was actually breaking into a manufacturing plant at night. I was actually really nervous. I mean, what would someone want to be in that plant? Like, what was there to steal? Whoever it wasn't likely to be a local thief. It was more likely to be some kind of international or super rich outfit of super thieves. They might be agents from a foreign country. It might be anything. I mean, I wanted to quit and go home, I really did. But when I got close enough to see what was going on, I was completely taken by surprise. It was something maybe even scarier than anything I had been envisioning. It was a literal monster. It was like a big dog-headed, long-legged bear man, I guess. I mean, it was a brownish sort of color, or maybe orangey a little bit, I guess. And its face reminded me of a golden retriever a little bit, the way its tongue hung out. I mean, at first glance, it looked like a really big, really sleepy, really friendly dog, only it was standing up on its hind legs like someone giant was holding it up from behind, under the armpits. Its eyes were only half open, and had a sort of a goofy expression on its face. Then, it saw me, and suddenly I was facing off against a monster. It no longer looked friendly. Its tongue no longer lolled out. Its eyes were no longer lidded. It glared at me, and its eyes seemed lit from within with anger. I got on my walkie-talkie to tell my superior that a giant dog from Mars had torn through the chain-link fence like it was Swiss cheese. He squawked something back, and the big dog turned his entire body to face me, baring his teeth, growling, and glaring. The boss told me something about how I better handle the little doggy myself because he was taking a nap, and the sound of that message seemed to annoy the big canine-headed man as much as it annoyed me. And he started to make himself smaller, bringing his eyes down to my level. It was the first and only time that I've ever seen an animal make itself smaller and become more intimidating. It dawned on me that this creature might be about to make my life a very unpleasant one to have to live. I began to walk backward, afraid to take my eye off that beast. When it began to advance toward me, however, I took that stupid squawky walkie-talkie and I threw it at the beast's nose, scoring a direct hit. Then I took off running toward the closest door to get back inside. As I turned quickly to pull the door shut behind me, the werewolf thing slammed into it and shut it for me. Returning the favor, I locked the door for the creature. Teamwork. I ran back to the office where the other guy was listening to AM radio and tapping his foot to the latest single. I shouted at him to call the cops because the perimeter had been breached. He woke up and said something like, "I thought you told me it was a big puppy dog." I told him that puppy dog somehow gnawed or pushed its way through a chain-link fence and nearly ate my behind for dessert. So it was time to call the police. He still objected, so I reached for the phone to do it myself. That's when he saw I wasn't going to let up about this, and he consented to call the cops out to the location. Now I'm just going to tell them it was human burglars, though, he warned me. I said I didn't care if he said it was Superman and Green Lantern, as long as he got the cops out there to scare that bear-sized upright canine away. So by the time the cops came, the Dogman was gone. We both stayed inside until they got there, so we didn't see when or where it left. The cops informed us that this was not a break-in by burglars, but rather by some kind of an animal, most likely a very large bear. One of the cops disagreed, saying there was no way a bear would have the strength to do something like that. They were both 100% convinced that some kind of animal did it, though, because those links were not cut. They were broken somehow. One of the cops suggested getting a stronger fence, but the other one said there is no stronger fence commercially available, and so he said we should consider installing a second electric fence inside the interior of the old fence as a double barrier. We made note of none of these suggestions. We were temporary security hires, not management. The cops laughed, and then my so-called superior tried to get me to fill out his paperwork for him. He said it was only fair since I had seen the monster and he hadn't, but I ignored him, and I tapped my foot to the Archies, playing on my AM radio. And so that was the way that me and that other guy sorta half-assed our way through my one and only cryptid sighting. The end. Welcome. Come on in out of the cold rain. I got a warm fire burning in here for you. I moved out of my basement hovel in the city for this here shack in the woods. Did you hear that? What was that? When I asked the real estate guy if the place was comfortable, he sort of paused a long time. Then he said, "You'll get used to it." Still, it was only $750,000. And in upstate New York, that's a steal. I mean, it's got its own fireplace. Sure, it's just one room with an outhouse in the back, but that room has a fireplace in it, so I'm not complaining. Speaking of not complaining, I'd like to thank tonight's executive producer, Jason Regina, for making this episode possible. Jason had left our channel memberships, but now he's back and we're glad to have him. Jason gets to see our weekly secret uncensored Dogman episodes, far too wild to run on this channel, which come out on Sundays or Mondays, depending on my work schedule and stress level. We have lots of other ways for you to help the channel out. Here to fill in the deets is our international spokesmongrel, Henry Lee Dogman. Thanks, Biggie. And thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that one. It cuts off after, I think, 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.